Our next speaker this morning is Dr. Miriam Feldmann Kaye.
There's a question to open the windows if you want air. I'm not sure that you want. Anyone that close the windows.
After Miriam completed her undergraduate studies in the theology department of Cambridge and her PhD here in Israel, Miriam now lectures in the Jewish philosophy department at Ilan. She also serves as visiting assistant professor at Jewish Theological Seminary and as chief editor of the new St. Andrew International Encyclopedia for Jewish Theology. In addition to work in interfaith dialogue, Miriam's chief areas of interest include the interface between contemporary Jewish thought and continental philosophy, as evidenced in her recently published book, Jewish Theology for a Postmodern Age. As a personal disciple and admirer of Rabbi Sacks, we can also thank Miriam for her instrumental role in the initiation and organization of this conference. B'kasha.
Thank you, Professor Ross. I was going to say I didn't recognize some of those sentences from the bio I sent you, so thank you for elaborating. It's really wonderful to see such a great crowd here in person and an even larger crowd via the live stream. And I have to say it's nice for me to take a small break from organizing the conference, even if I have to give an academic paper to do so. I'm going to present one claim through one method, inspired by the quotation that Dr. Tamara Wright will bring, "We have a moral obligation to be clear," from Rabbi Sacks. Along the way, so this is part of some broader research. I'm going to touch along the way on the ideas of on Rabbi Sacks, on Baruch Spinoza, Hannah Arendt, and of course Michel Foucault towards the end. So the claim is that the ideas present in the early writings of Sacks set forth the path for his entire body of writing that was to follow. They show his resistance to Enlightenment philosophy as one major theme. The seeds or ideas which he would later develop had been planted as far back as 1973. I'll weave in his early writings to my argument and show how these ideas set the stage for the Jewish thought he was consequently to pioneer. And today I'll focus on just one part of this argument, the Enlightenment philosophy from 16th, 17th century onwards, and its implications for modern Jewish thought. So I propose that, to a great extent, Sacks saw the Enlightenment almost in its entirety as a colossal failure. This failure was exemplified by and culminated in the Shoah, which embodied for him the collapse of an entire Western system of thought. Sacks writes with great pathos of the hope of the emancipation of the Jews from the shtetls of Europe to bring about a new Jewish Enlightenment, but paints its downfall in a poignant way. For me, he writes, the image that captures its almost unbearable pathos is of Sigmund Freud in 1939, exiled from Vienna, where his people were about to be turned into ashes, frantically writing his last work, Moses and Monotheism, in which he tried to show that Moses wasn't Jewish. By then, it was too late to do anything but weep. Certainly, Sacks believed that the Enlightenment was a philosophical renaissance of sorts, grounded in the emphasis of the pursuit of knowledge and ontological aspiration. It was founded upon the belief that the power of reason could bring about liberation and progress, and it's largely recognized to have been captured through Immanuel Kant's essay, Was ist Aufklärung, what is Enlightenment? The motto of Enlightenment is, as he said, have the courage to use your own understanding. And Sachs described Enlightenment philosophy as the emergence of science and reason, and his respect for such an aspiration spans his works earlier and, of course, later. Sachs admired the freedom, equality, and human dignity, the tolerance, and respect for individual rights, and the creation of a just and compassionate society, which this intellectual movement was believed to have set in motion. In some ways, it was even a realization of Judaism and a fulfillment of Jewish values, even stating that humanity, ethics, and religious truth were universal concepts arrived at by reason and accessible to all. However, it's also clear that Sachs viewed this position as limited at best and at worst flawed. The values of equality, toleration, and reason were ultimately eclipsed via the Great Eclipse, as he says in the following ways. First, that reason and science, the reason and science that Enlightenment propounded, were highly abstract. Second, reason was dependent on its universalization. And this manifested itself blatantly. The Enlightenment valued the universals, he said, and despised the particular. He understood this in relation to different movements in modern thought, including linking Kant's stress on human behavior and synthetic truth to the emotion value of Hume, the focus on action of Jeremy Bentham, Mill, and utilitarianism, as well as the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre as total failures. Why? Because they were predicated upon a division between universalism and particularism, and in doing so excluded Judaism, which required its conceptualization as a particular. He took this claim very far, arguing that the whole thrust of post-Enlightenment thought has been hostile to religious belief in general and to classic Jewish beliefs in particular, claiming that it runs counter, actually, to the Kantian idea that ethics is essentially universal, a matter of rules that, if they apply at all, they apply to all. Whereas Sachs, in contrast, wanted to posit that covenant is predicated on obligation and relation, and Professor Reinhold has referred to some of these ideas already, and not autonomy and abstract reason. The notion of covenant, as opposed to rationalist critique, is difficult to sustain, however, or it's worth considering, in fact, his treatment of Baruch Spinoza, who he does not call Benedict Spinoza, but Baruch Spinoza, a Jew whose early modern critical approach contributed to the intellectual development of this period. Despite Sachs's critique of the Enlightenment, as early as 1989, he had set out an ambivalent but also sympathetic response to Spinoza, noting his hidden Jewish Marano tradition and refusing to relinquish Spinoza's Jewish identity, to write him off, as many thinkers have done. Covenant was more important than critique. As Sachs once said, I don't love all Judaisms, but I love all Jews. Enlightenment and the ways in which Jews had set out to respond to it had directly led to the cause of divisions between Jewish communities, which in 1993 he'd termed the fragmentation of Jewry in one people. This had been preceded by his call for unity, and thus he sought to recontextualize these internal frictions as Arguments for the Sake of Heaven, published in 1990. The capacity to coexist became part of his vision, Faith in the Future, already predicted or envisioned in 1995 when he lays out the major themes which were to occupy him for decades to come: dignity, Jewish identity, Jewish life, ethics and faith, morality, unity, and hope. What Enlightenment was meant to do, to further progress, fraternity, equal rights, and what actually happened were two very different phenomena. As he wrote, emancipation heralded a new messianic age of universal brotherhood, and all laws which tended to keep Jews as a separate people were at best irrelevant, and at worst, they impeded the progress of civilization. Thus, he termed the Enlightenment the failure of success. At root for Sachs, as I mentioned, was that Enlightenment was served as a forebearer to the Shoah. It's interesting, it's hard not to get into a discussion with some of the people in the room, especially Rabbi Dr. Harris and Professor Reinhold on their book on Soloveitchik and Nietzsche, and you bring in Sachs's responses to Nietzsche at the beginning, but nonetheless, he does in many places bring together Nietzsche, Hegel, Kant, and Heidegger, portraying them more often than not as virulent anti-Semites and a manifestation of German Western philosophy, noting that the irony of ironies was that the very countries that gave birth to the Enlightenment were also those that gave birth to racial anti-Semitism and eventually the Holocaust. One of the subjects that preoccupied him, in not going into post-Shoah theology now, was his understanding of the problem of evil. His early references to Hannah Arendt tell somewhat of his understanding of evil as an Enlightenment phenomenon. Sachs spoke of Arendt's idea of the banality of evil in the capacity of modernity's collapse into totalitarianism. Not incidentally, Arendt tries to find solutions to help humans become humane, since modern philosophy had not succeeded or failed to bring this about. His reading of Arendt, for whom modernity meant ultimately the loss of the world, allows him to begin a process of seeking out a new grounds for a vision of humanity. In parallel to the fragmentation Sachs had described, Enlightenment philosophy had led Jewish thought, and now we've moved on from this eclipse or failure of success, and now I'm going to refer to how this played out in his relation to Jewish thought. Jewish thought, as he saw it, had defined itself or come to be defined as modern Jewish thought, and this is a term that many of us use, of course. However, he was resolute as early as the mid-1980s that this approach never really could have worked and never truly did. The examples he laments of Moses Mendelssohn, Hermann Cohen, From Reason to Hope, placing reason within a Jewish framework, were ultimately doomed, even if at the time they were justified and necessary. And this focus wholly affected his views of other modern Jewish thinkers. Such an occupation was for Sachs tangential. And even looking at the Rav Soloveitchik scholars, I'm still going to make this claim. Modern Jewish thought and thinkers, he claimed, were asking the wrong questions. I'm going to look this way. We can have a discussion afterwards. They were still wholly occupied by modern approaches and how they could be synthesized with Jewish traditional values. And I'm going to look at Dr. Freud Kandel for the courses that she taught me in Cambridge many years ago, and much of this is based on her conceptualization of this. Even if the modern Jewish thinkers of the late 19th century who welcomed modernity were living in a different time, a period he called post-Enlightenment pre-Holocaust, not just as a chronological issue, but as a philosophical one. And he considers this in relation to Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and Rav Kook as less relevant to the late 20th century because neither of them lived to see or experience the Holocaust and the State of Israel. And as he claimed already in the late 1980s, the essential hopes of Samson Raphael Hirsch and Rav Kook have been realized. In other words, what's next? What are the options? This leads him to claim that chapter in European intellectual history is now closed. So we're left with a question. What now should Jewish thought entail, if not the engagement of modern Judaism to which we have been accustomed? Now, very interestingly, as early as 1973, in fact, I think his first published work, it's wonderful there are many people here who could, would have their own whole encyclopedic, but I think that his first published work of 1973 was on the thought of Franz Rosenzweig. And perhaps surprisingly enough, he had argued that the dialogical Jewish philosophy of Rosenzweig could have moved us past the eclipse. Potentially for Rosenzweig's move to the dialogical, but also his notion of return, accessibility of the Hebrew texts, return to the sources, the Hebrew language, the openness of the Lehrhaus as a place of Jewish education. He claimed that this thought was indispensable to us. As he said, a more fundamental intellectual turn away from the rationalism and universalism that had held a previous generation captive, as in the modern Jewish thinkers, towards a reassessment, the value of an unapologetic assertion of Jewish differentness. Suffice it to say, and tragically, in terms of Rosenzweig's life, his Judaism did not live to see its full fruition because he did not experience the Holocaust. And it was for Sachs, alongside Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, et al., that it is too early to tell, in his words, whether they heralded, or whether they would have heralded, a new type of post-Enlightenment thinking, and, as he calls it, the first signs of the end of Enlightenment and the birth of an era of, get ready, post-modernity. Okay. Not modern, not postmodern. He resisted a turn to postmodernism, even though it is a movement complex and self-contradictory which resists enlightenment. A rejection of the postmodernism, a vehement rejection of the postmodernism of Foucault. These were some of the ideas he shared with me and let's say, encouraged me at the least to put to one side. Foucault was also a great critic of the Enlightenment, in a sense mirroring the, or counter-mirroring the description of Kant in Foucault's work. Foucault's works on the meaning of the Enlightenment, the order of things, the archaeology of knowledge, etc. But he decided not to go in this path, and I think Tamara is going to shed some more light on that. So what instead? Again, what are his options? So he claims that it should embody a cumulative and revolutionary shift in attitudes away from assumptions that had prevailed for almost 200 years. As early as 1985, Sachs was already speaking of a journey, a movement away, in his work Torah Studies. New Jewish thought must embody rethinking modernity, not integrating modernity. In this context, the role of Jews now in public intellectual discussion is critical. The type of Jewish responses should reject modern Enlightenment philosophy, or let's say, as far as possible, to reach a position of, as he says, integrity and wholeness. He himself embodied his mission and laid out a model for Torah im Derech Eretz, which he claimed was not somewhat aligned to modern values. And this model had already been set out in 1991 in Orthodoxy Confronts Modernity. One of the other options that he developed was through biblical interpretation. We're going to hear more about this later today. As he wrote, the freedom, equality. Let me just preface this. If the Enlightenment values, as I noted at the beginning, of equality and freedom as originated in Enlightenment philosophy was flawed, then how was he able to further those values? And he decided, to root those values of liberal society in biblical theology. So, the freedom, equality, and human dignity, tolerance, respect for individual rights, and the creation of a just and compassionate society, as I just quoted, were found in the Bible. A reframing of the idea of the individual as well was necessary. Herein addressing already the idea of the consumer and the role of the family already in 1995. Not least importantly, that these themes were all to be interconnected. This was already laid out in 1993. These disciplines are interwoven. And so even as far as the year 2020, if Judaism was to respond to these internal issues, it also was obligated to deal with economics, ecology, sustainability, politics, and so on. Why? Because it's all part of Derech Eretz. To conclude, the Jews for Sachs now have a more prominent and vocal role to play on the stage of humanity. And just thinking about his TED Talk in 2017, we can see that he embodied this himself, speaking to a far broader audience. Whilst he confronted new challenges as they arose, and he did indeed do that, and even, on perhaps the most recent example through the coronavirus crisis, where I think people look to him, what's Rabbi Sachs going to say? We're waiting for his response, and he did respond to that. So although he was amalgamating these new phenomenon as they arose, they were very much based on all of these earlier works that preceded them. And final quote, it's a call to action. The intellectual challenge facing Jewry today is quite different to the modern Jewish thought. It is to think and write as Jews. We have earned the right to do so. And in the wake of the failure of the Enlightenment, we have the duty to do so. For 200 years, Jewish intellectuals felt the need to distance themselves from Judaism. That is true no longer. Enlightenment had precluded Jews from contributing to humanity, and Jewish thought in some ways had become entangled in an Enlightenment problem and represented for Sachs a knot to be undone. He undertook the task not only of untying the knot carefully, but he also examined and retied. And this was his redefinition of Jewish thought, no less of Jewish life, and a new model of Jewish philosophy with which to contend in contemporary times. Thank you.